Last week, after a bit of an absence from rugby training, I was just catching up with one of my teammates before the session proper got going. You know, it was a crisp March evening. The kickers were practicing their shots at goal, hookers practicing their line-out throws, and we were just casually passing a ball back and forth to each other. Standard small talk about this year's Six Nations, how we were doing in the table, whether I could play at the weekend. And then he asked, "Everything all right? You've not been out to training for a while." Now, normally, that question has a very predictable answer from me. And I would say most men are the same in that they don't even pause to think about it, because it will be something like, "Yeah, I'm fine, all good." Or in my particular case, "Yep, not too bad." And it's almost automatic, a reflex more than a response. And for years, that's exactly what I would have said. But this time, something slightly different happened because I paused. And in fairness, I did have a look around to see if anyone else was in earshot. And I realized I actually wasn't fine. And in that moment's pause, I was weighing up whether to open up. I was upset with things at home and some fairly sizable and quite recent changes in my life. I was anxious about work and the real potential I was going to lose my job. And I was getting a bit lost when it came to where I was going to be in my life in, say, a year's time. And I was trying to carry all of that myself. And honestly, in that moment, it wasn't so much a fear of saying what was going on for me, as if like the problem was with me. I was actually trying not to burden the guy that I was chucking the ball back and forth with. But, you asked, here, catch this. So knowing I was about to say it out loud was surprisingly uncomfortable, because I had this constant chorus of "say it, don't say it, say it, don't say it." It was ringing through my mind. And it's the anxiety that the moment you say it, you're no longer like this calm, capable bloke who has everything under control, because you very quickly become human and all the problems that go along with that. So the chorus of "say it, don't say it, say it, don't say it" was ringing out in my mind. But instead of giving the usual answer, I trusted the guy I was with. He'd asked the question, and I said something closer to, "Honestly, not really." And you know what? The world didn't collapse. A massive earthquake didn't happen and suck me into the center of the earth. Like a meteorite didn't come out of the heavens and put a hole in the ground where I was. And he didn't look at me like I was a degenerate fuck up. If anything, the conversation after that became more real. And strangely enough, once the words were out there, I felt substantially lighter. And it's not because the problem had disappeared. All of those problems are still there. But because I wasn't carrying it alone anymore. And that moment stuck with me because it made me realize something about the way I am, the way I've changed, but also the way a lot of men deal with life. Because we are so good at looking composed on the outside, so good at keeping things under control. And ultimately, we're so good at appearing to be stoic. And right now, Stoicism is having this moment. It's come back with a vengeance almost. You see it everywhere. Just be disciplined, control your emotions, stay calm, be stoic. And in many ways, that advice can be incredibly powerful, but it also raises an interesting question, because when many men say they're being stoic, do we even get what we're aiming for? And are we actually building resilience through stoicism? Or are we just getting better at hiding what we feel? So I'm Kieran, and this is The Men We Are, a podcast for men who are trying to understand themselves a little bit better. The ones who sometimes feel like they're supposed to have stuff figured out, but quietly suspect that nobody really has their shit in order. And they're just happy to listen, learn, grow, and maybe just become a bit better. So today we're digging into something that's become hugely popular in this modern self-development world, and that is Stoicism. And you've probably seen it everywhere without realizing It's repackaged with emotional music and cool visuals, and it's quotes from, Roman emperor and philosopher Marcus Aurelius. It's wisdom from the other Greek philosopher Epictetus. It's advice about discipline, control, strength of your emotions. And for a lot of men, these things feel like an antidote to the chaos of like modern life. But there is a subtle confusion that is occurring, because there are actually two different things people talk about when they say the word stoic. And I have to admit, it was by learning the two exist that I was inspired to put today's episode together. Because there is Stoicism, the philosophy, and there's Stoicism, the personality trait. And mixing the two up can change the entire meaning. So today we're asking a very simple but important question. Are men rediscovering an ancient philosophy that builds resilience, or are we accidentally training ourselves to disconnect from our emotions? So the philosophy of Stoicism, it began around 300 BC in Greece, ancient Greece, and later became hugely influential in the Roman world. And we know that some of the earliest known philosophers were from ancient Greece. It was thinkers like Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, and they were collectively known as the Stoics. They were trying to answer one big question, and it's, how do you live a good life in a world you cannot control? So as you'd expect, their answer wasn't emotional numbness. It was something much more subtle, because the Stoics believe that suffering, it doesn't come from events themselves. It comes from how we interpret those events. And this aligns so perfectly with what we said in the previous episode from season 1, the stories we tell ourselves about our lives, where we established that we don't suffer from what actually happened, but the story we tell ourselves about what happened. So Epictetus, he famously wrote, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." So the philosophy focused on three main ideas: control what you can, accept what you cannot, and build character through virtue and discipline. And interestingly, modern psychology has borrowed heavily from this way of thinking. So many techniques used in cognitive behavioral therapy, some of you will know that as CBT, actually mirror Stoic practices. Things like examining your thoughts, reframing your reactions, separating events from interpretation, seeing what actually happened. And studies have shown that engaging with Stoic exercises can improve resilience and your overall well-being. So the original philosophy, it wasn't telling people to ignore their emotions. It was teaching something closer to emotional regulation. But somewhere along the way, perhaps in an attempt to make things more accessible, the message got simplified. And as ever, I have my own simple message for you, that if you are enjoying these podcasts and the content is speaking to you, resonating, provoking thoughts, whichever platform you use, please do follow, rate, download, anything to raise the popularity of the show. Or if you know someone that this would hit with, recommend it to them, because if it's helping you like it's helping me, chances are it will help someone else. So if we stick with that idea of simplified messages, the internet has created an abundance of them. And if you scroll through social media for long enough, you'll start to notice a pattern. And it's these pictures of black and white statues, quotes in massive letters about discipline, never complain, a confident man never explains, control your emotions, all of these things. And it paints a picture of a man who is completely unshakable, emotionally bulletproof. And if we're honest, because of what we could call hang-ups about what it means to be a man and how that manly man is, that idea of being unshakably, emotionally bulletproof, it's incredibly appealing. But, life is messy. And regardless of the right or wrong, or the gender role expectation confusion, men are still mostly expected to be providers and problem solvers and protectors, manly men. So the promise of becoming calm, controlled, and immune to emotional chaos, it feels pretty powerful. But psychologists are starting to point out something that's quite interesting, that in many cases, what men think is stoicism, um, like this confused version of the philosophy, is actually emotional suppression. And those two things, they might look similar from a distance, but psychologically they're so different, because suppression says I feel something but I push it down, whereas regulation says I notice the feeling and I decide what to do with it. So one brain imaging study even found that suppressing emotions can reduce your empathy when when you see others that are in pain. It's almost like you become emotionally immune. And in other words, the more someone trains themselves to suppress their own emotions, you not only are you disconnecting from your own emotions, but it becomes very easy to disconnect from other people's emotions, which isn't ideal if you want friendships. It's definitely not ideal if you want a healthy relationship, and you will not find a meaningful connection if if you're emotionally stunted like that. So as ever, if we really try and keep the link to man specific challenges, when you bring masculinity into the equation, things get even more interesting, because men don't develop these habits in isolation. They are shaped by culture, by society. And there's fascinating research on men in high risk environments, like offshore oil rigs, um, bloody dangerous places. And in those settings, emotional control, it's not seen as philosophical, it's practical. It's almost part of your survival toolbox. Because in places like that, if something goes wrong, you need to stay calm. And showing panic or being vulnerable can threaten team safety. And the same applies to firefighters, to soldiers, to first responders like paramedics. Because in those environments, being stoic can literally save lives. And the problem is that once those habits are built, they don't always switch off when the crisis ends. And what I mean by that is, when you leave your kit in your locker, you swipe out and head home. You're still going to be in that mindset. And I've seen that, like my mindset of trying to be very logical and very black about decisions I make at work, it spills over into my personal life sometimes, where I have to consciously almost switch my emotions back on when I take my headset off and step off the airplane. So your emotional armor is staying on. And, as I said, I've mentioned before that I've definitely noticed it in myself, even having pursued a mindset as a younger person to achieve that in my real life, because I thought that was a really sensible thing to do. But as I said, when that same approach carries into personal life, it can create these strange moments, because when someone close to you is talking about feelings, logic certainly isn't normally the answer. Like, sometimes it can, of course, help, but it can have the opposite effect to what you're trying to achieve. Like, I have no doubt when I have had arguments and have tried to see them from a purely logical standpoint, I know that although I wanted calm, I probably achieved the opposite, and it just caused frustration. And it's funny. I'd never do it because it's the stupidest thing you can do. But it's like saying to someone that's really angry and hyped up, calm down, because you might as well just throw a can of petrol on top of the fire. And learning to open those emotional doors, whether that's through therapy, mindfulness, meditation in my case has helped, a bit of uncomfortable self-reflection, it can feel like learning a very, very new and foreign language. But the interesting thing is that when men do start speaking about their emotions openly, people do sadly react with surprise, almost like they weren't expecting that response. Um, and it creates a strange paradox because society says it wants men to open up. But when they do, people don't know what to do with it. So, therefore, my story from the start of today's episode, where my mate asked me the question, I gave him an honest response, and we had a real honest and proper conversation. God, I was so happy because it could have gone the opposite way. He could have been uncomfortable and just said, "Oh, I'm just going to grab something from my back," and he could have just run off, you know? And this is where the research starts to get a bit concerning because studies looking at stoic attitudes have found that people who strongly suppress emotions, they're going to experience higher levels of anxiety, depression, and certainly stress. In some cases, they are also less likely to seek psychological help. And they just simply endure things internally, very quietly, and no one knows what they're going through. Another review found that emotional suppression was linked with lower perceived social support and poorer emotional quality of life. And I see that as one of the most vicious of vicious cycles. Because for me, if you suppress things and you have a perception that you don't have any social support, you know, a friend network, family, whatever, there's a fair chance you'll suppress more because you have no one that you think you can talk things out with. And because you're suppressing alone, the perception you have that you have no support gets reinforced. So when you have another problem, you suppress again and on and on and on, which leads to another paradox, but this time with slightly more far-reaching consequences, because the very strategy that men use to appear strong can slowly make them more isolated because connection depends on vulnerability. Without it, you might gain respect, but you won't necessarily gain any level of closeness. So what's the point? Like, for me, we need to figure out what real stoicism might look like. And the most important thing with that definition that we're going to come up with is that real stoicism, it never actually told people to eliminate emotion. It told them just don't be ruled by it. And I have to be honest, I had to work to get my head around this because at first that distinction can be really confusing, purely because if the aim is not to be ruled by our emotions, that to me still sounded like a bit of suppression. But one way to understand it is to think emotions are like information, like they're purely signals that we can interpret. So anger might signal injustice, or fear might signal danger. Sadness might signal loss. So the emotion itself isn't the problem. It's just what we're feeling in that moment. But that's the bit that's important because the emotion is giving us an idea about what's happening. So therefore, the question becomes, what do we do with the emotion? And a Stoic approach would say, notice the emotion, understand what information it's telling you. Then decide your response deliberately rather than just reacting impulsively. And that's remarkably similar to what modern psychology teaches through mindfulness and emotional regulation. Feeling something will not make you weak, but being completely controlled by it can lead to some destructive behaviors. So pretending it doesn't exist at all, which is what some people have thought what Stoicism is, that's something completely different entirely, and it's a nonsense. So maybe the real question isn't whether men should be Stoic. Maybe the real question is, what kind of Stoicism are we actually talking about? Because one version says, don't feel, don't talk about your problems, deal with everything alone. And the other version, the one that we're trying to pursue, says, understand your emotions, control how you react to things, focus your energy on what you can actually influence. One of them is suppression, and the second is discipline. And confusing the two can have a real impact on how men live their lives. So one of the most fascinating things about the modern revival of this Stoicism is that it does reveal something deeper, and that's that men are searching for discipline, for meaning, for strength without being controlled by their emotions, maybe, and some kind of internal stability in a world where it feels quite unpredictable. And the irony is that although we might have become lost, that is exactly the questions that the Stoics, not questions, the question the Stoics were asking 2,000 years ago. How do you stay steady when life gets difficult? But somewhere along the way, the message, it became simplified, which is perhaps a reflection of modern society. And we need everything now rather than being satisfied with curating and nurturing something over time. And real Stoicism, it never asks men to shut down emotionally. It asks them to develop like a character, like the character being the summation of their entire personality that could face difficulty without collapsing under it. It's the ability to just say, this is hard, but I am going to keep going because I acknowledge what I'm feeling. And we don't achieve this by pretending nothing matters, but rather by understanding yourself well enough that your emotions are not going to control you. That's not emotional silence. That is purely maturity. And I am confident that when I think of my quest for emotional intelligence, which is certainly what I'm on, I know that that's the version of Stoicism men are actually looking for. Not the one that tells us to hide what we feel, but the one that helps us understand ourselves well enough that we can face life honestly and without fear. And in the end, that might be the most important question any man can ask himself. Not whether he looks strong, but whether he truly understands the man he's becoming. And of course, if you are becoming better through listening to the show, please do subscribe, recommend it to someone else that would benefit. And until the next episode, it will be another bonus episode. Have a good few days. Keep working on yourself. And with that, I wish you the best of luck.